Last month, President Biden issued an executive order banning the import of Russian seafood, one of many sanctions we've put in place in response to the unprovoked, unjustified aggression, war crimes, and atrocities of Vladimir Putin in Ukraine. The United States imported more than $1.2 billion of crab, cod, and other fish from Russia in 2021. Banning those imports is intended to ensure that American consumers are not funding Putin's war machine. While I fully support the president's goal, I regret to inform the president and all of you that this well-intentioned ban won't work. Not under current laws and policies, not under the less than watchful eye of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. And here's why. As we've heard repeatedly in this committee, NOAA only requires transparency and traceability for 13 species groups through its Seafood Import Monitoring Program, or SIMP, representing only about 40% of the species imported into the United States. SIMP requires importers to track fish from the initial catch throughout the supply chain into their entry into the United States. There is no requirement for traceability for the remaining 60% of the species entering our markets, which includes most of the seafood originating in Russia, including pollock. So while the executive order in theory is supposed to block seafood imported directly from Russia, how will it actually work if most of that seafood is not required to be tracked under SIMP? It actually gets even more complicated. Russia sends a significant amount of seafood to China for processing, hiding the true origins. In fact, 26% of the fish caught in Russia is already sent to other countries for processing, making it a product of the other country. Unless that fish is one of the 13 species that happen to be covered by SIMP, and we know most of them are not, the Russian origins of this seafood is untraceable, and the ban is impossible to enforce. But if NOAA required SIMP for all species, we could ban all seafood imports from Russia. Until that happens, Russian seafood will continue to line grocery store shelves in the United States, and American consumers will continue unwittingly supporting Putin's war machine. The ineffectiveness of the Russian seafood ban is just one example of the many reasons why I and others have long advocated for NOAA expanding SIMP to cover all species imported into the United States. In fact, when NOAA first developed the SIMP program to address illegal fishing, seafood fraud, and slave labor in the seafood supply chain, they explicitly stated in the final rule that they plan to expand the program to cover all species. Since then, story after story demonstrates the need to expand, but NOAA consistently refuses to do so. Even more disappointing, NOAA refused to testify at this hearing today. They won't act, and apparently they don't want to talk to Congress about why they won't act. During my tenure as chair of the subcommittee, we've had several hearings highlighting the need for full transparency and traceability of all seafood entering the United States to make sure that it's not resulting from IUU fishing, from fraud or slave labor in the supply chain, and it's not being sold in our supermarkets and restaurants, undercutting American fishermen. The bill I introduced alongside Congressman Graves, H.R. 3075, would do just that. The America Competes Act includes critical components of our bill, and it must be enacted, especially given NOAA's resistance to acting and their blatant disregard for appropriately dealing with these issues, despite everything that we've learned over the years. At one of our hearings, we heard from Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Ian Urbina, who told us about a Cambodian migrant who was held captive on a trawler at sea for 3 years, shackled by the neck, and forced to catch fish destined for American shelves. NOAA was at that hearing. They heard it, and yet they've done nothing. We've learned about the deadly secret of China's fishing vessels illegally fishing in North Korean waters, violently displacing smaller North Korean boats, killing fishermen, catalyzing a more than 70% crash in the once abundant squid stocks. Squid, of course, is one of the species that NOAA does not include in the SIMP program. And so we continue to import all of this through China. and yet NOAA has not acted. We've learned that the Department of Labor identified 68 seafood species produced by slave or child labor that we continue to import into the United States. But SIMP only covers 12 of those seafood species, and still NOAA has not acted. We've learned that SIMP covers only 29% of seafood imports from China, China being a notorious bad actor. Almost 60% of offenses in the industrial fishing sector are related to Chinese-owned vessels, according to a new study. But despite pressure from both sides of the aisle to be tougher on China, NOAA has not acted. Finally, we learned that SIMP doesn't cover many Russian seafood products like pollock and salmon. Even though Russia is engaged in IUU fishing, government reports estimate that over 16% of seafood imports from Russia were obtained through illegal fishing. But I think you know, and I'm starting to sound like a broken record here, NOAA has not acted. Seafood traceability is imperative for preventing the illegal importation of Russian-derived, often IUU-related seafood into the United States. NOAA must immediately take steps to expand SIMP so that we can keep slave-caught, illegal, and Russian seafood out of this country and stop funding Putin's atrocities.